Well, I think we need to try something.
Not just respect the sign in front of the chair. I think this is the one.
Next time I see you, you'll be oh wow,
Okay, good afternoon everybody. I'm going to make a start and try and catch up some time. And to catch up some time, I'm not going to introduce all of the members of the panel, otherwise I think that would use up most of the time we've got allocated. It's not because I don't know much pronounce Alice surname. So we heard from the panel just before lunch about the legalization of sports betting in the US following the repeal of PASPA. Understandably, many people see this as a fantastic opportunity, and it's certainly the latest gambling gold rush. Now, without wishing to dampen the enthusiasm of all of those who are desperate to stake their claim, the countries represented on this panel have had a relatively long history of regulating sports betting. And I think there are a number of lessons which operators, the US states and advisors should take heed of. In my experience of advising in this sector, regulation, or at least government policy, tends to operate on a pendulum basis. And whilst the US regulation of sports betting is swinging from a position of a complete ban following the Black Sox scandal of 1919, I think they're going to meet a lot of the European regulators swinging past them, going in the other direction. And the European move away from a liberal regime has been driven mainly by two factors. The first is a general concern about consumer harm and protection from problem gambling. The second, which is particular to sports betting, is about integrity. So in sport, unlike casino gaming, the participants, the players, have the ability to influence the result. And this risk has been exacerbated by the introduction of in-play betting, or live betting as it's also called, which allows betting on the next run in cricket, the next throw in football, soccer, the next game in tennis, and I don't know if this is the right US analogy, but the next strikeout in baseball. Somebody can tell me later if that's wrong. And the integrity match spot fixing concern has led to various of the issues that we're going to talk about on this panel. But broadly speaking, in one camp, you have people who say that there would be no incentive to fix matches if you couldn't bet on the event, or at least there would be far fewer opportunities to do so if in-play betting wasn't allowed. The alternative argument is that people will still bet on the event anyway, and preventing match fixing and protecting the integrity of the sport is more easily achievable in a regulated market where you've got licensed bookmakers who are under an obligation to inform sports bodies when they become aware of suspicious betting patterns. However, what also comes out of that is the need for sports to have increasingly sophisticated integrity operations and to educate players. And that costs money. And typically the sports governing bodies have used their control of data, which bookmakers need to take bets on the event, as a way of securing funding from bookmakers. But actually I'm going to start with advertising and sponsorship. So gambling advertising is huge in Europe, as is sports sponsorship. And the American TV networks are already rubbing their hands with glee at the prospect of increased advertising revenues, which is something they already had experienced when DraftKings and FanDuel first came on the scene and were competing with vast amounts of advertising dollars. The US sports also view sponsorship as an exciting additional potential source of revenue, and we've already seen the MGM NBA deal. In Europe, by contrast, things are starting to go in the other direction. So you've got sports starting to weaken or terminate their association with gambling, with the English Football Association having terminated their sponsorship with Ladbrokes, and we're going to talk about tennis a little later on. So I think all of the countries represented on this panel have seen an increase in concern about the proliferation of gambling advertising, particularly around sports events, and particularly where it seems to be targeted at children. So we can all speak about it, but actually I'm going to ask Stefano to talk about it first, because in Italy we've seen the most dramatic change.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. And yes, we are experiencing quite of a change in terms of banning advertising and publicity on all forms of gaming in Italy, following a decree law converted into law in December this year. I wouldn't bother you by mentioning all the bureaucratic steps and the text of the law. The fact is that the banning is quite severe. It's very severe in its wording. Nevertheless, it has to be activated in many parts, especially considering the fact that some of the provisions will have to be enforced starting from January 2019, second half of January. That means that the existing contracts of some operators with sponsoring with either football teams or similar activities are still valid. Nevertheless, of course, I don't want to keep the microphone for me only, because there are many colleagues that have enough interesting points to raise. But out of this, probably we will have to learn a lesson and see what the gaming industry is able to say. I wouldn't say to oppose, but to say in objecting the fact that these activities are considered in issuing that law so negative, and possibly by the reactions of the groups that do or provide advertising, there are reasons to expose in discussing this kind of provision.
If I just come in there, just on points that both of you made, there's an interesting contrast, whether it is as between maybe what we'd say the common law world and the civil law world, but what you described, Stefano, is state regulation, very much the state taking a top-down approach, perhaps responding to public opinion or not, I don't know. But in the UK, I think, David, the initiative being taken on the part of the sporting body in terms of the relationship between what you described as the Football Association and Ladbrokes. And similarly, I think, to Ireland, because of course there's quite a cultural similarity between Ireland and Britain, and in the way we have evolved on the sports betting front. You have the primary and the biggest sports association in Ireland, the Gaelic Athletic Association, have completely banned all forms of gambling sponsorship from their games. They have the highest number of younger players. Soccer is the next. And to echo what's happening in Ireland, again, the Football Association in Ireland has announced a review of its relationship with a bookmaker, I think it may be Ladbrokes as well. And again, that's not surprising, they haven't cut it off. And just the other point to mention as part of the discussion is how many teams in the Premiership League in the UK are backed by gambling companies.
And that's right. And I was reading the newspaper this morning, and the chief executive of the National Health Service has said that of all of the Premier League teams that are sponsored by gambling companies, I think, or at least shirt sponsors, only Bet365 makes a voluntary contribution to funding problem gambling, and he's saying all the others should do as well. And actually, just to illustrate the pendulum nature that I was talking about as far as the UK is concerned. So when the Gambling Act came into force in the UK in 2007, it was at that time a very liberal approach, and the view was that gambling is lawful, so you should be able to advertise it like any other lawful product. But the result of that was that there was a huge increase in gambling advertising, and although there's a voluntary code which generally says gambling advertising and the like should be restricted to after the 9 PM watershed, there was a carve-out for gambling advertising around sports events. And the result of that is that every football match you watch on TV, half-time, before the match, after the match, there's advertising by betting companies. And of course, there are lots of kids who are watching those matches and staying like sports events. Ala, sorry, go on. Why don't you tell us about the position in Spain?
Well, in Spain, gambling advertising is allowed, and during the TV broadcast of sports events as well. We are now, while viewing that the gambling market is always a politically easy target, we are now moving from a self-regulatory code of conduct into a specific regulation on advertising and responsible gambling. So advertising now is going to be more restricted. However, it still will be allowed, but the decree will introduce some limits and some requirements as to the content, for example, especially during the advertising during the TV broadcast of sport events. But I think that the regulation needs to be somehow well balanced, because advertising and gambling as well as sport is, I would say, these are related activities, complementary activities, and we need to consider that, for example, if land-based gambling had always had many restrictions in terms of advertising, but the community where the gambling, where the land-based casino, land-based bingo or bookmaker is located, everybody knows. But in the case of online gambling, it's absolutely necessary not only for the people to know where the operator is based on, or where the operator is, or where you can find the operator, but also because the fact of the operator being advertised mainly on TV gives consumer confidence, and also brings the consumer to gamble in an authorized, supervised operator. I think that extreme measures like the one in Italy, for example, it's a counterproductive measure because it feeds indirectly the black market also. So in Spain, actually, we are now talking about 0.4% of individuals with gambling problems against other markets where, for example, gambling advertising is going to be prohibited. I think the statistics shows that the numbers are more high.
Tom, sorry, I think you wanted to say something.
Well, no, I think we've covered the UK very adequately. I was just going to make the observation that being able to advertise as a licensed operator is a key advantage of why you want to get a license. So when you look at introducing absolute prohibition, I think you're taking away a key advantage of wanting to get a license, and I think that could be a possible boon for the illegal markets. And I think this is about lessons to be learned from regulation. I'm always a bit queasy about absolute prohibitions. I'd always much rather see regulatory controls.
Well, for France, the situation is slightly different. I think when we enacted the online gambling law, we took in fact, we created what is the betting right. So basically, if you want to place a sport bet on any competition, you have to do a deal with the sport event organizer. So whether it's the World Cup, or whether it's hockey, or whatever, you actually have to have a deal with the French Football Federation, the UEFA, so far so forth, or even any type of sport event organizer. For example, the Tour de France is organized by Amaury, which is not a federation. So we had the kind of holistic approach, top to bottom, saying that if you have to organize a bet in the Tour de France, you need to actually have a deal with the organizer, and you're going to pay back a percentage which is anything between 0.3 to 2% to the organizer. And taking the example of, for example, Roland Garros, the French Open of tennis, this is what the French Tennis Federation does, but there's other tennis competition. So what does it do to the advertising? From the beginning, it was not strict regulation, but obviously, the responsible gaming aspect was built into the law. So any type of advertising has to basically give the numbers to code in terms of, dealing with addiction and so on and so forth. Now, you have to realize that in France, the two incumbent operators, whether it's PMU and Française des Jeux, are paying the largest lion's shares of the advertising, and therefore are state-owned. So we had actually the regulation was driven by the state itself. So what I see in France is there's been always very strict controls. For example, there's no gambling ads before any program which is dedicated to minors. There's a lapse of 30 minutes, so far, so forth. So I think France has stricken a kind of a balance. I'm not talking about the tax regime here, but the way the industry need to finance the sports industry, how you get the rights to the event, and I think this is a very crucial thing in sport betting, and each of the federation and event have a different way of doing things. So we see less and less issue around this. And I think, this regulation which gives back to the industry, including for sports, because, everybody wants to place bets on Roland Garros or the Premier League, but who wants to actually pay something to the hockey Federation, or the pétanque, I don't know how you call this in English, but basically them themselves have been getting back. So I think this is a very different approach, but quite interesting.
Look, I think the French situation sounds wonderfully simple. So for once, so it's good to hear. I think there are two separate issues which we're hearing. The first is the actual linkage between the sports sector and the gambling sector. And we focus a moment in respect of advertising, but at least my country goes deeper than that, particularly in respect of some of the winter sports, where they run essentially not-for-profit clubs. And the linkage which is attacked the most is the fact that the clubs can run slot machines. So that has been perceived as the most malicious link, and the one that's been targeted first. It doesn't mean that there isn't also attacks in respect of the shirt sponsorships, in respect of the linkage which may come from advertising. But then you look at something like the betting right, which in our country is essentially a product fee, and you've got to look at the source of that right, which differs on market to market. In Australia, the actual source is the location of the event in a lot of cases. So, because the actual right is provided by statute. And the statutes can only be conferred on a state-by-state, province-by-province basis rather than federal. So you end up having, in our country at least, an extremely complex regime where you have, in racing, let's assume racing promotes a form of sport, where you essentially have different product-free arrangements in each state with each category of sports, and with each category of racing, and it becomes inordinately complex with different contracts in relation to each form of the racing activity. Sports is a little simple. The difficulty which emerges, and Diane touched on this, is that you have the powerful sports and those sports which are less popular. So you might be talking about football in this part of the world, or in my world, other forms of football, or cricket, or tennis, or something like that. And they are sophisticated enough, they've got enough funds to have their own integrity departments and essentially be able to manage integrity and use part of the fees which they get from sports under this statutory right. But the sports don't. You've got a conflict which we've heard from various on this panel, in things that I'm going to touch on first, in respect to the license, or the white market, so to speak, against the grey market. And how can it be, in respect of these fees which are generated under the product fee arrangements, which in our case go up to 4% of turnover, and that's not a tax. The tax is far higher than that. And essentially, it's a barrier to entry in respect of people onshore. People offshore don't have the same forms of limitations which might apply. I think we'll come on to integrity in a minute, but this can get inordinately complex. And if we're looking at the lessons which this, what's an example is portrayed by the regulated markets. There's so many differences here. And the US needs to really study it very, very closely, or they're going to end up the same mess, by the sounds of every country they has.
Yeah. I think potentially you'll end up with each state being like a different country in Europe, every state having something slightly different. I want to move on to data, which is, of course, critical for sports betting. So, and whereas in the days when you could only bet pre-match or pre-race, this was primarily about the fixture list and who was participating. With in-play or live betting, there's an enormous amount of additional data that's required by the bookmakers, both to be able to offer the bets, but also, importantly, so that they can manage their books efficiently. So without going into all of the IP issues, there have been a number of cases around Europe and at the European Court of Justice, which, broadly speaking, established that leagues have no intellectual property rights in their fixture lists, but they do have rights in live data, i.e. the data generated whilst the event is in play. And the sports governing bodies have generally used this requirement to generate a new income stream, but it also gives them a means of establishing contractual relationships with the bookmakers, under which they can potentially control the type of bets which bookmakers take, but also establish information sharing where bookmakers identify suspicious betting patterns and the like. And as we've heard from our president and from Diane, also in Australia and France, there's a statute which requires bookmakers to enter into agreements with the sports governing bodies to be able to take bets in the first place. When I talked about integrity in my introduction, I described the opposing camps. And it's undoubtedly the case that in-play betting, live betting as it's also called, creates many more betting opportunities and also inevitably more opportunities for manipulation of the sports event on which bets are being placed. And actually I'm going to turn to Tom, because Tom is General Counsel at Genius, who are one of the main companies that both supplies sports data to bookmakers, but also increasingly has been involved in working with governing bodies to help them protect the integrity of their sports. And I think you've been working with some of the leagues in the States, so I think maybe you can give us some practical experience.
That's right. We spend a lot of time in the States, speaking to both leagues and operators. And I think when you're talking about integrity, I think you have to understand that truly there aren't really two opposing camps, because everybody wants sports integrity, otherwise there's no such thing as a betting market if you don't have integrity. I think that's the first point to make, and I think the best way to achieve integrity is through regulation, because that's the only way you get transparency, you get control of betting markets. And the fact is, in the US today there is a huge unregulated market. The fact that regulation is coming means that transparency and control are brought over those markets, and that can be a really good thing for betting operators and for sport, or legal betting operators and for sports alike. When it comes to what we do, obviously we work with sports to help them monetize their data. We help them, we monitor what's going on in their sports to make sure that any anomalies are spotted early. We're not suggesting when we're spotting those anomalies whether there's corruption, we really point the anomaly out to the sport. And what sports do with that is a whole separate question, but the sports obviously need to have the finances and the infrastructure to make sure that they can investigate it properly. But if we're talking about lessons for the US, I think it has to be that any successful sports betting model in the US will be operators working with sports. Great example of that, MGN, an NBA deal. It was great to see, I think, because I think it's exactly the sort of deal that should be being done in the US. Because if the operators try and do it without the involvement of the sports, that's when the problems are going to arise. And I think that's the way it will continue in the US. I think that the sports and the operators will work together. Whether it's about, I mean, this conversation about IP, which you hear about a lot in the US, I don't think it's necessarily about IP, it's about products. Because if sports are working with the best operators and the best data providers to create the best betting product, then it will be the licensed product that's used and the illegal markets will be eradicated, which is the whole point of regulation in the first place.
But do you think that the states, when they legislate, should actually mandate that bookmakers have to enter into an agreement with sports governing body?
Well, some states have done that. I think 4 or 5 have done that. I think that's an argument sports push. I don't think it's the only way that integrity can be achieved, and it's something that I think you'd have to ask a sports governing body in the US as well. They thought that was the best thing to do. I think there are other ways to achieve it, and I think the ways to achieve it, as I just said, is making sure that the best product on the market is the licensed product, is the one that's done in conjunction with the sports and the operators together.
Tom, it's very interesting to hear that in the US, that the whole issue of the control exercised individually by sports bodies over their product and having integrity agreements has just been the subject of a review of a very lengthy report in Australia that's covered by the paper out there. It's called the Whipple Point. Essentially, they came to the view that essentially allowing sports to individually control integrity was flawed, because it essentially enables there to be inconsistent treatment in respect of integrity issues by the sports. It inhibits law enforcement because essentially there's no coordinated collation of the data in order to essentially assist in minimising the prospect of match fixing. And the recommendations included the formation of a national body which would essentially coordinate all the integrity information to essentially minimise the prospect of integrity. It's still awaiting the government's response, submissions are due, but it's been looked at in extraordinary detail, and it's looked at principally in respect to the fact that only to date, it's only been the large sports have been able to do it. The smaller sports have been able to, and it's recommended that both the small sports and the large sports essentially work together under a national process.
I agree with you totally. Something, this might sound a strange thing for me to say as someone where part of our business offering is a monitoring integrity service. I actually don't think it should be done by third parties like us. I think it should be done centrally. And I think that's one of the challenges the US is going to have following the lifting of the passport ban, is that we are seeing, in the medium term anyway, as a state-by-state solution. It's going to be very interesting to see how that's going to be managed, because each state is going to approach these issues separately. My view is that eventually you're going to have to see some sort of federal overlay protocol, whether that's statute, whatever it is. But I don't think it's going to happen in the immediate term. But overall, I agree with your point.
And I think it's, you know, across the suite of countries, it is very notable that the stronger the sporting body is, the more influence it has in being able to carve out a particular deal for its own sport. So in Ireland, I think the only sport that has negotiated for itself a special deal that you have to get a permit from the horse racing body, which is Horse Racing Ireland. You have to get that particular permit if you're a bookmaker, and if you want to take odds in relation to betting on Irish races. But why should, you know, the horse racing industry in Ireland manage to carve out its own position? I completely agree with the remarks that there needs to be some coherence to that, and I think probably the way in which drug testing in sport is organised centrally, there's a model there for the sports, all of the sports being brought under the same umbrella, so there's a coherence and a consistency in terms of the negotiation of different requirements to manage that whole aspect of overlap with the in-play betting.
Yeah, I agree with the approach, but bringing another angle, what I see is really from the antitrust side of things. Because when you see, for example, one really large sport federation imposing their condition, and we had the situation in the horse racing industry with the PMU in France, which basically, you know, owns all the food chain, if I may say so, into the horse racing, that creates quite a lot of discrepancy in the market, and that's made me really uncomfortable. I also wonder, I think the initiative about having a central body regulating integrity is amazing, but, you know, having gone through the hell, because there's no other word of GDPR the last 2 years, I really wonder how this kind of things could actually work out, because the number of intermediary suppliers that we need to plug into a platform to transfer the data is just absolutely mental. So I think also, as the industry, it needs to look for pragmatic solutions which are actually technically, you know, achievable. And this is where I think we have a lot of work to do.
Yes, of course. I mean, what I agree is that the competences should be centralized. The bodies regulating sports at the federal and so national level should have a department dedicated to that, taking the know-how from all the private and non-private organisms around Europe, not only each single country, that have already had a relevant experience in that field. We have examples, we had very good examples of being active in that field in combating match fixing. And some initiatives have to be centralized and coordinated. Otherwise, it's a dispersion of strength, no? Of potentiality. In Italy, for example, I make just one example, not to bother the audience, but the League B, the second division, introduced something in the contracts of each single football player that was taking notice of what are the consequences of misbehaving, and the fact that they should have had a kind of courses of formation on that way of behaving in their sport career.
I think one of the most interesting recent developments, and I think it's had remarkably little publicity, has been the independent review of integrity in tennis, which was commissioned by the tennis governing bodies. And the committee's interim recommendations are as follows. The governing body should stop supplying live data, which comes direct from the umpire's chair, to bookmakers for the lower value ITF tour events. And the rationale there is because the players at the lower league, the lower levels of the tennis tournaments, earn no money, so there is much greater incentive for them to get involved in fixing matches. The committee also recommends that where data is supplied to bookmakers, the governing bodies reserve the power to impose additional requirements for certain types of matches, to impose additional limitations on matches involving junior players, to direct that data should not be supplied in respect of a particular match, a particular player, a particular event, that bookmakers should not make markets on tennis matches for which data hasn't been supplied, that bookmakers should enter into MOUs requiring them to notify the governing bodies about suspicious betting patterns, and finally they recommend that the governing bodies should eliminate any betting sponsorships from all future tennis tournaments. So that's quite a draconian set of recommendations. And what's more, the governing bodies, when they set up this independent inquiry, undertook that whatever the committee's final conclusions were, they would be implemented. And then at the other extreme, you have India, where betting is currently completely unlawful, where there is a massive amount of betting on cricket with unauthorised bookmakers, and there have been some enormously high-profile match-fixing, spot-fixing incidents, where the Indian Law Commission has recently recommended that sports betting be legalised as the best way to combat match-fixing. So, there you see the opposing views.
This is the point, exactly. Regulated gaming is the only way to combat crime on illegal gaming, match fixing, all what derives from application of illegal practice to gaming. It's the only way. We had an example in Italy because the debate on legal and illegal sports betting offer has gone along decades. When there was an operator that now is legal, at the time that was still illegal, not having an Italian license, that was advising the authority about suspicious flows of bets on certain games, football games. He was an illegal operator at the time because he didn't have an Italian license, but probably was giving information of relevance to the scope.
Yeah, I would like just to point out what are also, in my opinion, one of the two main issues for sports integrity. I say it is, of course, one of the biggest concerns of sports betting being regulated. And in the first place is the press, and particularly the general press, because whenever there is a scandal about match fixing, it never makes clear what are the consequences for the operator, who at the end of the day is the one who suffers the biggest consequences. And second, we need to consider the fact that any, for example, about US, any NFL, NBA match is already subject to bets. Bets are being placed over any of these sports, whether it is from the US or from somewhere else. So, I mean, the fact of regulating sports betting, or for example, offering a wider offer of products can lead to increase match fixing scandals, but not necessarily. So here also about the product restriction, for example, I think that indirectly it feeds the black market. And I think there can be different other measures as different than prohibiting advertising or restricting gaming products to find a safe environment, a well-balanced regulation because at the end of the day, the player needs to be happy, and the offer needs to satisfy the player, and needs to attract the player. Otherwise, the player will look for other options, will go to the black market. And
the communication, because of the web, is so widespread all over that it's stupid to think that if you advertise something, you induce somebody to bet or to play. They can find betting anywhere. Nowhere, no reasons for which advertising is an incentive. I mean, anybody, even minors, especially minors, can find their way in gambling anywhere. So to avoid forms of publicity, thinking that this could reduce or comprehend the problem, I don't think is sane.
sorry, and yes, and that's why I think that there are other measures. And for example, I understand a gambling operator cannot advertise in certain channels at certain hours. But for example, for a sport betting operator, advertise during the TV broadcast of sport events, I think is the right moment. But I understand that there must be certain limits, certain measures, and actually the operator is the one who is the most interested to comply with the social responsibility, responsible gambling, the protection of minor, and to comply with the gaming regulation. That given that not every operator applies the same diligence, so there must be some measures and restrictions.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. If you're going to fix a match, it's pretty unlikely you could do it on a highly licensed, highly regulated bookmaker.
We've probably got about 5 minutes left, so are there any questions that anybody has? Okay, and I'll carry on asking questions. I mean, the other thing I haven't really picked out, so in-play live betting, it's unlawful in Australia and it's unlawful in France, is that right?
Right.
Sort of. In-play betting online on sport is illegal. Telephone in-play betting on sport is permitted. Online and telephone in-play betting on racing is permitted. However, the Wood report that I referred to has indicated that further consideration should be given to reverse the current prohibition in Australia on online in-play betting, because, for the very reasons that we've been discussing about, it's inhibiting obtaining information about betting patterns relating to in-play activity on Australian sports. That is not currently accessible by the Australian authorities. And it's not so much that that's necessarily where the activity that's of concern is actually having. It's being able to detect the patterns through the betting activity, and that's not currently accessible to the Australian sports or the Australian authorities.
Is a WhatsApp call online or telephone betting?
WhatsApp's online.
It's online. So that would be prohibited. It's fantastic if you think of the effects, no?
Joe, I'm going to ask you a question, because when I was sort of making sure that I knew the headlines of the regulations of all the countries represented in this panel, I realised that Ireland is pretty lax, isn't it? I mean, you can do more or less what you want.
Well, I guess reflecting the economy and a small island on the edge of Europe, and thanks to our nearest neighbour, perhaps going a different direction in terms of its policy in relation to Brexit, we're going to become even more increasingly isolated, I think. Coping with that challenge in terms of gaming and betting, yes indeed, you're right, in general terms there's an openness there in allowing, in a very permissive way, all forms of sports betting. However, written into the legislation are a number of prohibitions that are more honoured in the breach than they are through enforcement action. So the 1931 Betting Act contains a prohibition against congregating in a bookmaker's premises, for God's sake. I've noticed a lot of bookmakers bringing in tea and coffee and other reasons to be in the bookmaker's shop. I would have thought that's contrary to the law. Secondarily, bookmakers shouldn't be calling out the odds. I mean, they run live horse racing and that's on the screen in the bookmaker shop. And thirdly, you're not supposed to publicise the odds by way of shop window or otherwise, and that's clearly breached. Now, I think there's been a lax enough approach on the part of the authorities. When the bill that's currently before Parliament is made law, maybe next year, if the government is still standing, then there will be a proper gambling regulator in place, and there will be a much more hard edge to the regulation because there will be a proper regulator to enforce it, and not just the police, where it comes at the end of a very long list of law enforcement activities.
Okay, I think I'll give you one more opportunity to ask any questions. Great. Andrew.
Joe, is the position in Northern Ireland the same as you've just relayed yourself? Because some in the room may not realise that Northern Ireland is part of the regulation of Great Britain.
Not able to comment because not holding myself out as licensed in that jurisdiction, so I'll have to kick to touch. I think broadly speaking, they're somewhere between the UK and the south of Ireland, and much as they are in relation to Brexit, where a majority of them voted to stay in the EU, they're probably going to go with the UK. So I just don't know. I think probably closer to the mainland regime in the UK rather than
No,
the south.
you're right, Andrew. I mean, the Gambling Act 2005 doesn't apply to Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland legislation is still back to 1972 Betting Gaming and Lotteries Act and some weird statutory instrument, but it's a bit like...
Still in advance of 1931.
Yeah, honoured in the breach rather than the observance, as Joe said. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you to members of the panel.
We're now going to have a very short break to make a decision on which session you'd like to go to. I think this room will now have the Latin American session. Next door will be GGR. And I think we need to have a break close to 10.
Thanks for that. Send that to me.
Really